Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Nicole Perra, the holistic psychologist here. I'm here with a self-healer named Theresa. So a little backstory. She has been on an incredible healing journey of her own for several years now. She's going to tell you all about it. But how her and I got connected is she was very, very active in the community, very active in the comments section, always kind of touching me with the comments that she was writing. You know, I jumped in her stories a couple times, and really, really profound stuff around healing. So I was doing a live then, and randomly she requested to come live with me, and I happened to pick her name, and she came on, and we talked a little bit about her healing journey. And a lot of you guys out there were relating to a lot of things that Theresa was talking about. So I made the decision. Obviously, the universe brought us together, so I thought we should have a little more of an in-depth conversation, and I'm hoping it could help you guys. So particularly today, we're going to talk about kind of two interconnected, very loaded topics, if you ask me, and I think if you ask a lot of the other healers out there, topics of self-care, prioritizing self-care, and boundaries, and how both of those kind of evolve in our journeys. So here is Theresa. Tell us a little bit. Hi, thank you. First of all, thank you for coming on and agreeing to have a further conversation. Yeah, you're doing incredible work. So tell me a little bit. This has been quite a journey for you. Can you tell me, tell us all a little bit about how you got started, or what kind of propelled you into all things self-healing, and then obviously, how did it go?
Okay. My name is Theresa, and I live in Canada, just outside of Toronto. Let's see, I'd say this started probably about 9 years ago when I separated from my husband. We have two beautiful children, and they were 6 and 8 at the time. And I would say that I was 41. I just hit 40. And I was going through, at the time, it was a breakdown, but I have redefined it as a breakthrough, and since redefined it as like an awakening, right? And so I guess up to that point, like the majority of my life, I would say that I was a happy person. I was a positive person. I was a helping type person, but I think I lived most of my life in that 95%, you know what I mean, of the subconscious. Like I thought I had a pretty healthy self-esteem. I thought, anyways, I just got to the point where I turned 42. I had lots of my life boxes checked. You know, I had a beautiful home. I had the 2 kids. I had the white picket fence. I had a, loving, fun husband. I had an active social life. And I was engaging in all those things that you think of as self-care. You know, I was doing yoga. I was fit. I was, doing girls' nights out, all those things. And but there was just something that I just had to acknowledge that I wasn't happy, right? And I just kind of woke up. So anyways, it's been a very long journey, and I've had moments and periods of where there's sort of little mini awakenings and aha moments. But one of the things that was a turning point for me was Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, and that really struck with me, realizing that I pretty much lived always sort of in the past, where I felt a lot of sort of resentment, anger, guilt, or I lived in the future, which was a lot of fear and anxiety. Both places not very happy places to be. And so when I started to live more in the present and actually spend more time just with myself, my voice just got very loud, and I couldn't even, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Once you sort of, it's very easy, I think, to just kind of deflect and project and blame and come up with reasons why. And there was a post you did, I don't know if it's your most recent one or 2 back, but where, I think you try to get to the point of like, you got all your basic needs met and self-esteem and belonging. And then you get to that point where you think, and I don't believe it's the end point anymore, where you self-actualize, you think, okay, I've reached my full potential. But then you realize that, that you're so tied to all those things that define you, past and future even. And I just felt completely lost. So I felt like, quite honestly, I woke up and I was like, it was like highway hypnosis, where I got to this destination, and I used the metaphor of, not only did I not arrive at a destination, I didn't even know how I got there, but I was a passenger. I wasn't even the driver, and I wasn't even in my own car.
Yeah.
So I pretty much just jumped out.
Yeah.
I
Tuck and
jumped out and
roll. Tuck and
yeah,
roll. Well, no, Teresa, I mean, you're really, I think, hitting on a lot of realities for probably a lot of us.
yeah,
Hearing you say that objectively, if you will, I've checked boxes, right? I was doing the things. I had the family, the house, even self-care. I was
yeah.
maintaining yoga and friends and everything that we hear and think and know on some level, because it is, the reality of it is those things are helpful, right? But I think what you're really highlighting is the power of the mind's role in all of that. So while all of that was the case for you, right, where your perspective point was, like you said, be it in the past or in the future, on that more moment by moment basis, that overruled, in a sense, all of the other
Absolutely.
stuff that was still there. And I bring that up because I can imagine a lot of people out here listening, probably might feel similarly, like, okay, why am I, if I do stop and ask myself, why am I not as happy or fulfilled or actualized as I could be? Because maybe a lot of people out there listening were like you and are doing the things, but still aren't. The power, I think, of the mind is so strong. It's such a part of, I truly believe, what is keeping us stuck, and then ultimately what allows us to heal. But you're talking about another point too, which I think is important and impactful and ties in with this idea of self-care and boundaries. A lot of us, I think, habitually assume roles like that of, child, sibling, eventually mother, wife, professional, and not to say that there's not value in those roles. Of course there is. And some of us even feel validated by those roles. But I think, again, you're sharing probably a similar experience that a lot of us have, when the majority or an over, kind of disproportionate amount of our value as a person is ascribed or to those roles, then I think a lot of people have that destabilizing experience as well.
Absolutely.
So two really big points.
Yeah. And I think for me that I started to realize that, if you think of self-actualization as like reaching your full potential, living your best life, whatever you want to call it, as sort of like the end goal, then it really isn't the end goal, because you could constantly be chasing, so what I found was that I was very goal oriented, and I had, gratitude journals, I had daily intention journals, I had, calendars with quotes and motivational post-its everywhere, and I was doing all the things, right? And I always had multiple self-help books on my nightside stand. And what I realized was that, it's kind of like, that's why when I jumped on, I've been going through that stuff, and you were so helpful in helping me unpack that I started to realize, like, it's almost like, that child that's, like on the park, doing something new. And it's like, Mom, look at me. Like you spend your whole life sort of look at me, and trying to identify, where your natural abilities and talents are, and build and hone those skills so you can identify yourself in roles and functions, achievements, whatever. And then I'm trying to get to the point where I'm just trying to transcend beyond that. Like I'm trying to, it's funny. It's like ironic. It's like you build all this up to really just erase it all. Like I'm aware of it, but I want to be free of it. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I often myself even think about a lot of the aspects of the healing process as an unlearning and undoing and unpeeling, right? That kind of metaphor that I think a lot of us use is kind of the onion, just peeling back all of the layers and the programmings and beliefs and the disconnect, really, to be honest, from ourselves. So I do agree with you. It's about, so let me ask you, as you started to fall into these realizations, and did things start to shift then when we talk about self-care, or how you were defining it? Like you said, I was doing the things.
Absolutely.
What started to then shift for you as this healing process evolved for you?
Yeah, I think that I really moved from a place of thinking of self-care as self-indulgent, and selfish, that it was time that you eked out, but it was in the cliche forms of what you think of pampering, right? So it was mani-pedis, it was retail therapy, buying a nice pair of shoes, right? It was going for a girls' night out and dancing, all things that gave you joy, that gave me joy, but they were still sometimes very difficult to do when you're busy, right? That involved other people, and that were still externally fed. Like I still was dependent on someone else doing my nails or someone else going, out with me. And so when I kind of, for me, self-care just shifted into the overarching sort of umbrella is just, it's when I'm by myself, like whatever that looks like. You know what I mean? I can see your eyes going, yeah, like that for me. Like I had this sort of epiphany. It was about 6 months after I separated, and it was Christmas Eve, and I was 41, and it was the first time in my whole life that I'd been alone, because my ex-husband, his Christmas was always on Christmas Eve and mine was on Christmas Day, and I had places to go Christmas Eve, like the girls were with him. I just didn't feel like pretending to be okay for everybody, do you know? Because which I knew I would. So it was the first time I was alone. And anyways, I have a story on it, but I just it was like an hour of like an out of body experience where I realized that I'm not alone. Like I have myself. That I am actually the most powerful person, and to 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 soothe myself, to make comfort myself. And then all of a sudden it just started a long time of just like going to movies by myself, like things that I love, going to coffee and people watching, right? And anyway, so my definition of self-care has now expanded quite a bit. And so I still do those things, like I do my nails. I'm seeing some girlfriends tomorrow. But the 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 daily self-care is really a lot of what you say. Like it's that journaling, it's that breath work, it's the going out in nature, it's the taking a bath. It really is easy, right? And it doesn't impact anyone. It doesn't take away from anyone. So of course it's not selfish. It's just taking care of yourself, right? And then as I started to develop it as part of my practice, because generally I try to have self-care as a proactive rather than reactive. I certainly check my resources, right, when I'm feeling like I'm depleting my reserves, and as self-care then. But it's much more easier, I think, to self-care when you're proactive and just, your cups are sort of always sort of more than half full, right? Rather than reactively going, oh gosh, I just, just telling a friend, canceling at the last minute because you need time for yourself. So anyway, so now I've moved now into more broadening, even more so, self-care that is much more difficult because it does impact other people, like creating boundaries, like saying no to people, like asking for help sometimes, right? Accepting help. So my definition of self-care is definitely broadened. It's definitely now more perceived as something that once you identify that there is another self, that there is a self that you need to care for, whether it's your child self or your conscious self, whatever it is, then it's not even a choice. Like if you are going to do for others, if you're going to care for others, you have to start first with yourself. Yeah.
There's Theresa. I literally at one point I got chills from what you were saying. There's just so much gold there. So, I mean, again, probably really relatable. I agree with you. I think sometimes even societally, right, we have different levels of messaging. And I'm going to go ahead and say even at the greatest level, right, global, societally, I do agree that a lot of us have defined self-care as those more indulgent based things, right? To feel good. And I do agree with you that it's beyond that. I do agree with you for similar reasons that part of the problem with looking for anything outside of us as the individual that we are I'm going to simplify this, to feel better in any way, right? Whether it's I feel better because my hair's did or my nails are done, or I feel better because I called that friend, and then they made me feel better. Again, not that we can't rely on support of others. Of course we can, but the problem becomes when it's an over-reliance, when our only route to feel better is through something outside of ourselves. And I agree with you. I think it becomes the biggest goal of healing. And this starts from many different factors. Obviously, it's probably a much deeper, longer conversation about where this originates, right? But a lot of us were not modeled, given the tools, other, et cetera, ways to self-regulate as children. We maybe didn't have adults around us that were, doing this self-care thing in this more intimate, emotion-based way. Because I think
Yeah.
that's part of self-care too, right? How do I make
Absolutely.
myself feel better when I'm tired, when I'm anxious, when I'm angry, when I'm happy? What do I do? And
Yes.
I think if a lot of us asked ourselves that question right now, we might not know. And I know there was a very pivotal moment when I was in my, I think it was probably mid-20s or late 20s at one point, and someone had asked me a very simple question about what I wanted. It was about something superficial, like holiday plans, say. And I honestly was so dumbfounded, I did not know. So if I did not know what I wanted, how I wanted to spend my holiday, you better believe I had no idea how to manage my emotions. So I agree with you. And I love that expanded definition of what self-care is. It means, and I love the examples you give, because a lot of people out there listening too might feel overwhelmed. Well, I don't know how to be alone. Alone has a lot of negative associations with it. I don't know what to do, what to start. And just like you said, it could really be as simple as, let me go take a bath. Let me go on a walk. Let me go to the coffee shop, and maybe I'll have my coffee to go. And maybe if I'm uncomfortable being alone in public, 10 minutes to drink a coffee might be a great start. I just think that's such a great evolution into self-care, because then when we really dig down into it, that evolves into, okay, now I know what I need to do, because we're not going to get there right away. I know how to take care of myself when I'm sad now. I know. And that is the most powerful place to be. Like you said, when we identify our own power and the reality of it, that no one can make us feel better except ourselves.
Right. And because if you ascribe to the flip side too, which is amazing, that no one can make you angry. No one can make you lose it and go insane. I've definitely lost it and dysregulated, but no one can make you. That is a choice. Like, that's the thing, is that, there's this book, Viktor Frankl. I love him, Man's Search for Meaning. And, that one of my favorite quotes is in between a stimulus and a response is a space, right? And you have control not only of your response, right? The power is within that space, but I've also learned that you can actually tighten the space or increase it. And the space itself is actually quite infinite. Like when I talk like this, I always kind of get a little bit embarrassed, because I'm like, oh my God, I sound so crazy and cuckoo. But I guess I've realized that there's certain things where, if you're hungry, you're hormonal, life stuff that make it difficult for me to create space, and it gets very, very tight. And so little things like, a comment or a slight at work, or something that just doesn't go your way, can trigger me to make the choice, right, to blame, to make the choice to reactively get angry, whatever it is. But when I'm more mindful and I practice those parts of self-care that involve solitude, that involve just daily check-in, right? Checking my reserves and giving only in proportion to what I have, right? Not overexerting myself, then I'm able to really open up that space quite a bit, and then it doesn't really matter what happens, because I'm able to realize that that's about them. This is about me. I can control me. And it's scary at first when you're used to not making decisions, when you're used to not taking responsibility, because it's just easier to react. But once you sit in it, it's the most amazing feeling. It's empowering. It's like, wow, I and nothing has changed except in here, right?
Yes, that's so incredibly powerful. And I agree. I do think a lot of people, this concept of accountability, acknowledging that there is a choice there. I had one, I honestly think it was a supervisor very early in my training, said something along the lines to me that everything is a choice. And at that point, I was really struck by that concept. And I was a little unsure of that. Over time, as I've evolved through my own healing, I completely agree with that. And I do think that there's a double-edged sword of accountability, right? Or self-responsibility, which is, it can be overwhelming. And it could be at its base level, a habit that we have to break. A lot of us get used to externalizing, blaming the world out there, because again, that's what we were shown. That's messages we received. But I do think the other side of that sword is huge power. And, I just think choice is everything. And I love that. So there is a space between it all. And I think what this, and part of the healing process, is shifting out of bringing the subconscious back in, right? that more habitual, mindless way of being, where for a lot of us, when we're in those moments, and you're right, when our resources are low, right? When we're really getting triggered at that deep way, right? The thing that's happening really takes me back to that really terrible thing that happened, a million different reasons. Our space gets smaller and smaller. But I love the suggestion you made. I make a similar one. I call it a resource check-in. And this ties together something that you referenced earlier too. We need to be so self-aware and acknowledge that there are days, moments, days, weeks even, where we're just limited on resources for many different reasons. Hormones, lack of sleep, right? Stress in our world. We're just not there. And I think in those moments, we do ourselves the greatest disservice by not taking more space then, and by snapping that text right back, right? When we are limiting resources, we are practically living in our emotional brain, and that's where all of those habits occur. And you referenced something earlier, and I think it's important, so I just want to highlight it here. The concept of the consistently, right? We can't wait until we're in that acute moment to then employ these coping skills. And that's why people who work with me are here. I say the word consistency a million times, because you are right. We need to have a habit that's so consistent so that when we're in that acute moment, right, we can do our resource check-in, hold space, step away from the triggering event if we need to have access to choice back. Sometimes it's time. We need to let our emotional brain deactivate enough so that we can bring online, right, a choice, because choice lives in our more frontal lobe, right? But if we're not doing that, and if we expect to, just employ breath work or mindfulness only in the as needed moment, we're going to be really disappointed. So I agree. And that's why it's about lifestyle and about habits.
Yeah. I would argue as well that the breath work, I don't get there certainly as often as I used to, but that actually doesn't help you in crisis. Like when you think about there's like a pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis continuum, and we use this for dealing with children, right? That asking a child when they've completely had a meltdown, oh, just count to 10 right now, do your breathing right. It's almost like when it's crisis, you have to wait to post-crisis to just let it run its course. Like that's the thing, is that for me, the breath work, the mindfulness, the resource checks, all those things, they happen almost pre-crisis, right? Like if you make them part of your practice, then you're always kind of stopping that crisis point, right? So if I do get to the point of where I've tipped because I just have neglected the signs that, like, you need to just say no right now. You need to not shut your mouth and don't offer to help right now. Or like you said, when your sister calls, just, put it to voicemail and text her that you'll call her tomorrow. Whatever it is, that if you don't pay attention to those warning signs, that's where all the work happens. Because once you're in crisis, once you've had a complete, and sometimes that's needed. Like I've had a good power cry, you know what I mean? Like I've just completely just said I can't hold it on anymore. I've tried to avoid the crisis. There's no breath work that happens in crisis. I'm not sitting there worried about trying to, do a body scan check it, when I'm completely lost it. Like, and I just realized, you know what? I just need to have compassion for myself, let myself just kind of like run its course. And then after, that's where it's like, why did that happen? What were the warning signs? Like, and also to not judge myself for being dysregulated, for eating like an asshole, or for whatever it is that got me to the point where I just had no strategies at that point. You know what I mean? I was just bare.
100%. And that is the reality. I mean, you couldn't have spoken it better. That is it. And we do because crisis is some version of an emotional reaction. I say that because that means it's our emotional brain, the limbic system, and all that's involved in it. And this is where trauma memories lay. So those of us who experience, whether it's acute or more chronic, low-grade trauma, right? Before we know it, we're right back in that. And it is and the way the brain works structurally, it does more or less limit the access that we have to the frontal lobe, to choice, to the ability to say or do something different. I love how you said in those moments, it is about compassion, and it's about removing ourselves from possibly complicating things more by the problem. There, our choice lies in terms of the reaction, right? If I can feel myself getting to that boiling point, it might be better that I'm just maybe I don't go to have those plans with that friend today, or, you know, I do take a few moments by myself. If I can even activate to that choice in that moment. And then afterward, it is about self-compassion, and it is about, I think, using that as a learning experience. Like you said, let me view, what is it? What didn't I do? How could I have known? And then I can even make an argument that on the deepest level, there is an implicit learning that is happening in those moments that you can tolerate really big, huge, uncomfortable feelings. Because I think a lot of us, especially those of us who have suffered big, huge, uncomfortable feelings, whether it be at the hands of a traumatic event or someone like myself who has had anxiety and panic my whole life, felt completely out of control, right? For me, my deepest level of healing came when I finally internalized. So I came to believe about myself that I could tolerate any and all feelings. So I think there's a beautiful, deep lesson on the other side of breakdown, even, which is shit, I made it. You know, my world didn't crumble. It was less than shiny, but everything's okay. And I think that's a huge pivotal lesson. So talk to me. You've already introduced this topic of saying no to others. Talk to me about the boundary aspect of this and when that really started to, I think, kind of present itself, what boundaries, you know, kind of you were finding you needed to install and how it was. Because I bring this up because boundaries is a huge topic, and it's, I think, an implicit part of healing, because before we know it, when we start to do different, some relationships in our life, right, start to feel the strain of that. So I think pretty much everyone out there who's listening at some point has come up against a boundary, something or other. So talk to me about how that all kind of interplayed in your healing and what the difficult aspects were for you. And
so for me, I grew up in a, you know, it's funny, whenever I read a lot about dysfunctional families, codependent families, because my family, I mean, I was very much like you. I didn't experience any huge trauma or abuse or anything. And so there's a lot of guilt that happened with, like, why am I not happy? Like, why am I worrying about these first world problems? And what is, like, so for me, every family by definition is dysfunctional. I mean, you're sticking together a bunch of people with different personalities, you know, different temperaments, you know, everything, and expecting them to, you know, unconditionally accept and love each other and nurture each other. It's just not going to happen. But, you know, learning always happens. So anyways, for me, I think I was in a very codependent, dysfunctional, whatever you want to call it, family. But it was a very we kind of environment of, you know, very strong willed personalities. My parents are very hardworking immigrants, very loving, who, you know, they come, you know, educated in Korea, but coming here to work in jobs that they're overeducated for, to do for their children. So their children are supposed to do for the family, right? So everything became about, you know, I was in school, I did very well. I was supposed to be a doctor. I'm going to be a doctor. And so that's how, you know, I've moved past. I don't, because it's a choice, I don't blame my parents. It's just to give context. But I went through school. This was the narrative I told myself, is that I'm smart at school, so I need to fully, you know, achieve to my potential and do math and sciences, even though I had interest in, like, arts and creative writing and stuff, but just stayed straight through to science. And I also told myself that I was the oldest of three, parents that often worked, latchkey kids, and so I was the mother. You know, my nickname was Mother Theresa when I was growing up. That I was the mother of my siblings. And so anyways, yes, absolutely. When I separated, everyone was shocked, because I never complained. I just pretended everything was okay. And so everyone was like, what? Like, what are you talking? And they thought I was like, I'd lost my mind. And then when I started to retreat and be very selective about who I let in, because I needed to process and sit in it myself and get very, very vulnerable. And I just was not comfortable to do that with everybody. I really did start to see where the boundaries were very difficult for me, you know, and that's where I'm pretty good now, but they do get more blurred the closer the relationship is with the person. Of course they are, right?
yeah.
And so I just now know to sometimes, you know, the toxic people that were in my life, I just kind of removed completely. That and then the ones that you can't and you don't necessarily want to, there's a history there. I've just learned yeah, just, I don't know, just take, I don't know what I'm trying to say, except that I've just learned to not let their, I guess, okay, I'm going to give you an example. There's a picture that I've used often of a girl. There are two kids on a pier, a girl in a pretty pink dress with all those pink balloons. And then there's a boy with a black hoodie with a bunch of black balloons. And the girl is she's in abundance and extending one of her pink balloons to this little boy. And the boy's got his head down and he's reaching out to get it. So to me, this is what boundaries mean. I don't think self-care is selfish when you are not in abundance, right? Like, so I don't give out all my pink balloons when I have none. But what I used to do is not only give out all my pink balloons, but I would take all the black balloons. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I would not only just run on fumes and not check my resources and give everything away, I also took everybody else's.
Yes.
And so I had that sort of rescuer, martyr, savior kind of mentality that I put on myself. And it was reinforcing to myself because, of course, who doesn't like to think of themselves as like someone who helps people and changes people's lives and makes people happy? But it's not that I realized that happiness that I derived from helping others was not my own, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it came at a cost because I felt very resentful. Yeah. So as I've learned to create boundaries, it's amazing. I don't do anything I don't want to do anymore. So that resentment is not there, because if I do something and I feel resentful, I was like, well, you made that choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
So, yeah.
I talk to people often, about the need to I did a post on honesty with ourselves this week, because I talk to people often, and I think the natural tendency, for understandable reasons, right, is if things feel, again, I'm going to simplify it, unequal to whatever extent in a relationship. So one is giving more than one feels they are receiving, right?
Yeah.
The more that happens over time, what creeps in and is a killer, in my opinion, of relationships is resentment, right? Because before I know it, I start pointing my finger at you, who, Theresa, who's not doing for me, who's not meeting my needs, who I'm doing too much for, when really the finger needs to point at me. Why am I still showing up in those ways? But I think this connects to, because it's interesting. I work with so many of us now, the percentage of people who will self-identify, if you will, as, energetically sensitive, so I can feel others' energies. I'm affected by them. That's real for a lot of us. So to speak to this point, when I'm in an interaction, and depending on how close this relationship is with the little boy in the black hoodie, right? Yeah. Before I know it, whether or not anything I'm even doing, regardless of what I'm even doing in the context of that relationship, some of us can very much sense the energy of the other person with whom we're relating. So there's that aspect of it, right? But then if you are the way you have I'm imagining this is probably a pattern for you of giving, of taking on negative, toxic energies of others. I don't know where it originated, but just from the little bit of your childhood that you shared with me, it sounds like, right, you were kind of embodying that role of caretaker, right, for your younger siblings, right, back from the days of being Mother Theresa, right? So I say this because we learn relationships, and we learn our part in relationships from the second we come to this planet. However it is you think we get here, right, we're deposited in some version of a caregiving environment. It looks different for all of us, who's involved or who isn't involved, right? But ultimately, we are getting some information, observational, about what we see in terms of people relating. Some of us are given direct messages about relationships, how they work, what's okay. Again, I'm simplifying it, what's not okay, right? And then we experience ourselves in relationships with all of these other people. Before we know it, we internalize a model, not only of relationships, but of us in relationships. So for you, just kind of dating this back, it sounds like that was one of your very early models of no fault of your own, of just the necessity of the family structure. You had to embody that role. So I'm not surprised to hear that, fast forward however many years now, of you embodying that role, you probably had some accumulated feelings and also blurred boundaries in a lot of relationships. And you are so right. So when I talk to people about boundaries, I say explore boundaries, right? Explore, the difficulties that you're identifying, and know that they're going to feel different, and it's going to be harder to shift and change, to speak to your point, the closer the relationship is to us. So you did say something interesting. How did you start to notice and navigate in the beginning the people that you would kind of put a harder boundary in and the people that you would let in a little more? How did you make sense of who was whom as you started to explore all of this more interpersonal world?
Yeah, I think I started first, obviously, with my immediate, my sister, who's my best friend, my mom, my dad, my brother, my immediate family. Children, that's a whole other realm of, as a mother, those boundaries gets completely blurred. Very difficult. But I think what I did is I came from a place of compassion. There's another quote. Who is it? You quoted him once too. But it was about, if you are intent on improving or changing, then you have to also be content with people thinking that you're foolish and stupid, right? That, everyone has their own agenda. And so I think initially when people, whatever form that took, whether it was like, oh, I'm really worried about you, Theresa, you're not going out as much, and you're changing, and my initial feeling, it was very visceral, where I was like, no, well, no, I didn't want to change. I wanted to stay stuck because it felt scary, very, very scary. But what I found was that when I came from a place of, instead of being defensive, I just assumed that it's much easier with it's harder, but much easier with the people that are closer to you. I just realized, they just want me to be happy. And so if I assume that people care about me, then I just became a broken record. And I just kept saying, like, look, I love you. I'm okay. I'm on the right path. I know what I'm doing. Even if I didn't feel it, I would say, right? Just to reassure them, to almost end the conversation until I was ready to sort of open that up a bit. And for some people, I still haven't opened that up, and it's okay. But as like I said, as I start, it's funny, as you start to create the boundary, then you can cross it back and forth freely. Do you know what I mean? Like depending on needs, depending on what's being solicited from me. But when you don't have the boundary, you have no idea when you're going to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you have choice. My mind went to you have choice. Once you have a space, let's bring that concept back in. Absolutely. You can start to exert choice.
Yeah. So that's what happened, is that I just started to create boundaries, and I just started to not necessarily, I didn't do more than I had in me. And so so the resentment started to go away. And then it's amazing, because once you start to fill yourself up first, once you start to live your truth and say what you mean and mean what you say kind of thing, then there's no disconnect, and you actually have way more abundance, right? And then the universe, you manifest all that. The universe, it's crazy, but it's been now almost 10 years where I'm telling you, when you texted me, like it was just a week ago, and I said, oh my God, I summoned you, Nicole. I thought that morning I was putting on my makeup, and I had like a horrific week at work, and I just called off everything, and I had a weekend of self-care, like fed myself physically, emotionally, mentally, everything. And I woke up on Monday morning, going to work, putting on makeup, going, gosh, I wish I didn't get to that point where I just had to collapse, but I needed it. I feel good, ready to start the week. And I said, and I missed Nicole's live. And I think maybe you were doing a YouTube video. I was like, I wish I could just meet her for coffee and just chat with her. I wish I lived in Philadelphia. And I'm not kidding. Then an hour later, you sent that DM. And literally, I was like, yeah, no, of course. Dr. LaPera, she's got 200,000 followers. She gets like hundreds of responses on a post within minutes. Of course, I put it out into the universe. Of course, she's going to DM me and say, like, do you want to talk? Like, what? What? I don't feel as scared scared as I did when it first started happening, because it would happen with like insects, it would happen with music, it would happen with people. Like that man who came up to you and your partner and said, "You're beautiful," out of the blue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because most of the time it happens when I'm alone, but literally sometimes when it happens like that moment where you DM me, I'm like, what? Uni? Like universe uni?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
really? Oh my gosh, are you kidding? Where is everybody? Like where's the camera? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing. It's the same thing with your professor emailing you back about,
Mm-hmm.
the DSM course, where you realize that the universe is so abundant and it has everything there for you, right? It's just,
Yeah.
you have to be ready to receive it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I love that. So I wasn't joking in the beginning of this, right? When I said I think the universe really did connect us. But, I
Yeah.
think, so when we, in terms, it's the cliched thing, right? I think RuPaul says it best. I mean, you can't love anyone else if you ain't loving yourself or something. I mean, there's so much truth in that. Whatever version of that saying, you've come across, that's the bottom line. And until we protect ourselves and our resources, I mean, even giving to another in any version of a relationship, whether or not we are, have had experiences. And I speak from my own personal experience with this, of a codependent enmeshed family, right? So even if I have that experience of boundary blurrings, really protecting that space. But you're bringing up a good point, because even those who are very close to us, and want what is well-intentioned from us, come to expect us behaving, showing up or not showing up in a relationship in a particular way, right? Just logically thinking about our relationships across time, right? Both parties become very predictable to each other. So when we start to do different, we are already introducing the unfamiliar to someone else. We're violating their expectations. So even if they do ultimately want what is best for us, they're going to register our difference in some way, because they're used to, and you've now violated the expectation. You're always on the other end of that text. Why aren't you there today? Are you right? So that's natural. And I think, to speak to your point, a lot of us fear or imagine so many million scenarios. I know I did, about what would happen if I did start to say no or take space for myself in these relationships. And ultimately, like you said, the realization that those who are in our worlds, who are close to us and love us and support us and want what's best for us, even if they might get shook or thrown by the initial shifting into having boundaries, into experiencing us differently, ultimately the end result of that, is acceptance, is not all of the things that we imagine and fear. Not that this applies to all relationships, because I don't know, maybe some of us out there, I know I had very conditional relationships, meaning when I stopped showing up in that way, that person did not love me and, accept me unconditionally. So I did have to drift from those relationships more fully. Then I think that reorganization that happens, that, like I said, opens us up so much more. And I can be honest and say that will ultimately benefit the relationship itself even more, right? So if you can feel like I can give when it's available to me, and I can say no when it's not, and all of this is accepted in a relationship, now I can fully accept and appreciate, I think, the other person in this new, more expanded way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you touched upon it again, but when you spoke about, creating a place of learning that comes from like completely losing it, you talked about it being very anxiety, fear based, and same with now, like when you stop, showing up for people because you need to care for self, that fear you have, like what happens particularly in the context of conditional relationships, that to me, fear for me is the underlying, like, everyone has their own sort of like anger iceberg, whatever it is, but for me it was always fear based, masking as something else or whatever it was. And so like for me, I just kind of pushed through it, and that's really has been my experience, is that when I just let myself, whether it's feel all the feels, push through my worst case scenario of what I was worried about would happen, even if it does happen, you realize, oh well, it happened, I'm still here, it's okay. Or it doesn't happen and you realize, like, real or imagined fear is fear, but you realize, like, so that was in my head, kind of thing. Whatever the outcome, the staying on this side of fear where you're not, it's still up here and you haven't acknowledged either that it was imagined or that it was real, but you're still okay on the other end of it. keeps you very stuck, right?
Yeah,
You know.
I completely agree. And that goes back to what I referenced earlier in terms of showing ourselves how much we can tolerate. And I agree with you. The biggest pivot for me, you know, in terms of healing my own anxiety, I had tools. I knew mindfulness, like I got it. I knew where it came from. Logically, I knew, right? I got it. But until, like I said earlier, I internalized that I could tolerate even the worst case scenario, that it was not imagined, that did happen, right? And I came out the other side of it, even to bring this in terms of the relationship conversation. Even if it was a terrible reaction that I got from someone, and if I did, you know, if the relationship did suffer in some way, or maybe even lost the relationship. Not to say that grieving isn't painful and loss doesn't hurt, absolutely. But again, it's that walking out the other side and showing you that even if the imagined was not imagined, that I can tolerate so much more. So I think that really speaks to the point too, for everyone out there considering, because I did a YouTube video on boundaries, and I always acknowledge there's 3 steps, right? There's sitting with ourselves. Let's tie this all together, right? Taking the moment alone with ourselves to realize what we need, to even identify the fact that, okay, I do need to put some boundaries in my world, right? So now I've stated it to myself, honestly. Then I have to state it to the world, either directly or behaviorally, right? To these relationships. And then I have to maintain, you know, those boundaries, because I think that's another critical place where a lot of us struggle. A lot of us tend to engage in some version of a feel bad when that kickback, which is very natural, like I said earlier, violation of expectation, we might hear about it from direct to indirect ways, but if I'm able to stand firm in my boundary, I think that can go such a long way for not only creating space for ourselves to heal. And that's the reality. A lot of people, I think, are going to share your experience of healing. I know I did. In the beginning, there was a big drive of me to be separate from, right? I felt so overwhelmed in so many ways, not only with all the new stuff I was doing to heal, but with all of the realizations I was having, all of the emotions that got wrapped up in it. And I needed, if I'm honest, distance from people in a very real way, you know? So I needed my own individual space, especially, and I say this because I know there's a lot of healers out there that are at the beginning of the journey and might be feeling similarly. This is before even my world has reacted to me, right? So I just felt like I need a little bit of time, you know? And then once when people started to notice I needed a little bit of time or experience me differently, right? Then maybe that negative feedback. So I think there's multiple stages of this in healing. Then that feedback starts to come in, and that's when I think it's really critical to make sure that we're protecting our space and our energy. So
yeah. I would say that most of my awakenings have been following or coinciding with periods of solitude. Yeah, for sure. Like my most recent one was over Christmas, and I got a new phone, and I just didn't load any of my social apps, right? And I just didn't use my phone for a week. And it was crazy. And it was funny because I was leaving my phone at like I always know where my phone is, but that's why I emphasize so much with you when you lost your phone. But yeah, over Christmas, I just spent time reading books. I just spent time with I was with my family, but I eked out time for myself. And that's what I would say is, if anyone asks me how to start self-care, I would just say start being comfortable with being by yourself. Whatever that looks like, start small. If you can reduce the distractions of noise, of people, of media, like unplug, then you'll start to, it feels really weird, feels uncomfortable. You start to feel self-conscious, but then it feels really, really good. And then you actually, I thought I was an extrovert my whole life. And I realized I'm actually I'm an introvert. I'm social introvert, but I get re-energized by solitude. That's where I find my center. So that's what I would say is for me, the most important part of self-care is just whatever you do, see if you can do it by yourself. Find comfort, and be by yourself. Yeah.
I love that. I think that's a beautiful place to end, because I think a lot of times many listening could probably relate to a lot of what we're talking about. And then the big question I always get is how to start. And I think that's beautiful. And I love the distinction that you offered. So it's one thing to be alone and be tethered to my cell phone on social media, because then how alone am I? And you don't even have to start with anything crazy. You don't have to carve out a day or a weekend or go travel alone. Literally, like I said earlier, a trip to the coffee shop where you're just with yourself and your thoughts. And you're right. Expect it to be overwhelming. Expect it to be uncomfortable. Don't expect it to be, for two reasons. A, the sheer unfamiliarity of it. You're doing something new. You're going to be uncomfortable and self-conscious. And then B, you're finally distraction free, which means, and this is why I initiate a meditation practice with people. A lot of people in the beginning will say, whoa, this is too overwhelming. I can't, I'm uncomfortable. I'm fidgety. I'm crazy. I'm going crazy. And that's it, because you're now with yourself. But I think that's a great kind of first step, how to just carve out some time, anytime, get to know yourself. Ultimately, what the deepest part of that process is learning what you need, what makes you feel good, what doesn't make you feel good. And then you get to that boundary conversation with yourself. Then you start to ask yourself, okay, how am I feeling in my relationships? And really being brutally honest and identifying when they don't feel good, that there is a role we're playing and that there is something we can shift or do differently. And one of the biggest tools to do that is to carve out space. And we do that with a boundary. So Theresa, thank you. This was incredible. So much wisdom. I am so grateful that you literally became part of the community. I don't remember how long ago now, and you're always buzzing in those comments. And I just knew something. And I so appreciate you coming on here and sharing your story. And I know that so many people are going to get value for this. And I know that our time together, this will not be the first and the last, because you're amazing. So I hope you take moments to feel proud of yourself. This is a journey. This is really cool. So thank you for sharing this with everyone.
Thank you. Okay.
Of course.
See ya.
Of course.